What if the greatest champion the world has ever known suddenly stood exposed by one of his few true rivals? At 83 years old, Frank Zane isn't chasing trophies or titles anymore. He's reflecting and revealing things the world never truly heard about Arnold Schwarzenegger, their rivalry and the truth behind bodybuilding's most controversial era. This isn't just another story of muscle and medals. It's about ambition, ego, and the fine line between greatness and manipulation. The man once praised for his calm, calculated perfection is now speaking with a sharpness only age and truth can give. A rivalry that began in the late 1960s, transformed into friendship in the golden era, and decades later, evolved into something far more explosive. So how did it all start? Let's rewind to where it all began. Before the fame, before the gold-plated Sandow trophies, and long before Arnold Schwarzenegger became a Hollywood icon, there was a man who represented the complete opposite of everything Arnold stood for: Frank Zane. Zayn wasn't born into the spotlight. He didn't have the booming charisma, the thick accent, or the Hollywood charm that would one day define the bodybuilding era. He was quiet, disciplined, and deeply intellectual, a math and chemistry teacher who approached muscle the way a scientist approaches an equation. Every gram of protein, every minute of posing, every breath between sets, all measured, precise, and intentional. That's how he earned the nickname The Chemist. It wasn't about any dark rumor, it was literal. Zayn had a degree in science and treated bodybuilding as an experiment in human perfection. He wasn't obsessed with becoming bigger, he was obsessed with becoming flawless. His physique was like a sculpture carved from marble, all balance, symmetry, and proportion. In an era dominated by mass monsters, Frank Zane's form looked like something out of ancient Greece. Across the Atlantic, a completely different kind of beast was emerging. A young Austrian named Arnold Schwarzenegger was tearing through Europe, smashing records, and captivating audiences with his combination of brute size and unstoppable confidence. He wasn't just training his body, he was building a myth. Arnold, the Austrian Oak, was already a global sensation before he even set foot in America. His goal was clear: become the greatest bodybuilder who ever lived, and nothing and no one would stand in his way. When these two worlds finally collided in 1968 at the Mr. Universe competition, the stage couldn't have been more charged. Arnold arrived like a conquering warrior, massive, confident, full of bravado. Everyone expected him to dominate. Frank, on the other hand, was the quiet American with the kind of understated confidence that made people underestimate him. But when they stepped under the stage lights, the difference was undeniable. Arnold's size was extraordinary, but Zayn's presentation, his symmetry, detail, and posing mastery was hypnotic. Every muscle flowed into the next like poetry. And when the judge's decision came down, it shocked the bodybuilding world. Frank Zane had beaten the great Arnold Schwarzenegger. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, some were stunned silent. Arnold, the man who seemed unbeatable, had been dethroned by someone smaller, smarter, and far more strategic. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. It proved that aesthetics and intelligence could outshine brute force. That loss haunted Arnold for years. Even he would later admit that Zayn taught him something vital: that bodybuilding wasn't only about being the biggest, but about being complete. He went back to the drawing board, humbled, driven to never let it happen again. For Zayn, it was validation, proof that discipline and intellect could defeat charisma and aggression. But beneath the surface, something else began to grow. A rivalry unlike any other in bodybuilding history. It wasn't loud or public, not yet. It was quiet, simmering, charged with respect and resentment in equal measure. Because from that day forward, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Frank Zane weren't just competitors. They were two sides of the same coin, one representing power, the other precision, one driven by dominance, the other by perfection. And while that night in 1968 marked the start of their story, it was only the calm before the storm, because the biggest firestorm in bodybuilding history was still waiting on the horizon. By the late 1970s, Frank Zane had become the embodiment of the golden era ideal, the standard by which all other physiques were measured. Between 1977 and 1979, he did what few thought possible. He conquered the bodybuilding world not through brute force, but through artistry. 3 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles cemented his place among the legends. But unlike his predecessors and rivals, Zayn's dominance wasn't built on size. It was built on strategy. In an age when muscle mass was becoming the obsession, Zayn was defying gravity and expectation. He didn't aim to overwhelm judges with bulk. He aimed to mesmerize them with detail. Every inch of his body was meticulously engineered. His waist was impossibly narrow. His lats flared like wings, and his abs, carved symmetrical and surgical, became the blueprint for aesthetic perfection. Zayn didn't just pose, he performed. His routines were quiet displays of control, like a ballet of muscle and light. He'd stand under the hot stage lamps, exhaling slowly, then strike a pose so fluid and precise that the crowd would go silent before erupting in applause. It was bodybuilding elevated to an art form. The science of aesthetics turned into poetry. To fans and fellow athletes, Frank Zane represented something rare, intellect in a sport of instinct. He was the thinking man's bodybuilder, the perfectionist who could calculate his sodium intake as carefully as his posing angles. He was proof that beauty and symmetry could triumph over raw mass and aggression. And yet, no matter how perfect Zayn became, he could never quite escape the long shadow cast by Arnold Schwarzenegger. Arnold, by that time, had transcended the stage entirely. He wasn't just a champion, he was a phenomenon. The Austrian Oak had already conquered Mr. Olympia a record 7 times, retired on top, and begun his march into Hollywood superstardom. Even in absence, his name filled every gym mirror and magazine cover. When fans thought of bodybuilding, they didn't think of the reigning Mr. Olympia. They thought of Arnold. It was a strange dynamic. Frank Zane was the best in the world, yet he was constantly compared to a man who wasn't even competing. Arnold was the larger-than-life figure who redefined the sport's identity, all charisma, confidence, and colossal size. Zayn was the quiet craftsman, sculpting a physique so refined it bordered on mathematical perfection. The two men couldn't have been more different, and yet they were forever linked as rivals, friends, and opposites. Arnold was the storm, loud, commanding, unpredictable. He could dominate a stage with a smile, a joke, or a single pose. Zayn was the calm, deliberate, introspective, and disciplined. He didn't need to command attention. He earned it through precision. Together, they represented the two souls of bodybuilding, the art and the spectacle. But behind the scenes, the balance wasn't so even. The industry, the magazines, even the fans, still revolved around Arnold. His charisma, his business instincts, his connections, they made him untouchable. Even Zayn's Olympia wins were sometimes overshadowed by nostalgia for the Schwarzenegger years. As if no matter how good Zayn became, he was simply living in someone else's movie. Still, Zayn stayed silent. He didn't rant. He didn't boast. He let his physique and his titles speak for him. But deep down, there was tension. A quiet frustration that years of discipline, years of refinement, were constantly being measured against a man who'd already moved on to Hollywood lights. And as fate would have it, their paths were about to collide once more. Not in friendship, not in film, but on the most controversial stage bodybuilding had ever seen. Because when Arnold Schwarzenegger made his shocking return to competition in 1980, the entire sport would be turned upside down. The 1980 Mr. Olympia bombshell. Nothing in bodybuilding, before or since, has caused as much uproar as what happened in Sydney, Australia in October of 1980. The stage was set for a typical Mr. Olympia showdown, a gathering of the best physiques in the world, all fighting for glory. But this year, there was something different in the air, something electric, something uneasy, because after 5 years of retirement, Arnold Schwarzenegger had decided to come back. The announcement hit the bodybuilding world like an earthquake. The man who had already conquered 7 Mr. Olympia titles, rewritten the sport's history, and transitioned into a rising Hollywood star was returning to reclaim his throne. Arnold wasn't just any competitor, he was the face of bodybuilding. His return was both thrilling and terrifying. Thrilling for fans who idolized him, terrifying for competitors who had spent years trying to build a legacy outside his shadow, and one of those men was Frank Zane. For Zayn, this wasn't just another competition. He was the reigning 3-time Mr. Olympia, the undisputed master of aesthetics, symmetry, and proportion. He had earned his spot at the top through meticulous control and relentless discipline. But suddenly, the king of science and symmetry was about to share the stage with the king of charisma and chaos. The return of Arnold Schwarzenegger meant that no matter what happened, the spotlight would no longer belong to Zayn. And to make matters worse, tragedy struck at the worst possible moment. Only weeks before the competition, Zayn suffered a bizarre and devastating accident, slipping in his pool and fracturing several ribs. The injury affected his breathing, his ability to train, even his confidence. For most competitors, that would have meant stepping down. But Zayn wasn't built that way. He refused to quit. He trained through the pain, adjusted his posing routine, and stepped on stage anyway, battered but unbroken. Meanwhile, Arnold's comeback was nothing short of theatrical. He had kept it secret until the last moment, announcing it only days before the event. Competitors like Zayn, Chris Dickerson, and Mike Mentzer had no idea he was even entering. And when Arnold finally walked into the venue, the crowd went wild. The judges smiled. Photographers scrambled. It was as if the Emperor had returned, and the entire room bowed in recognition. But here's the thing, Arnold didn't look like Arnold. His physique, though impressive, lacked the sharpness and density that had defined his earlier victories. The muscle separation wasn't as deep, the conditioning wasn't as crisp, and the symmetry, well, it wasn't Zayn level. For the first time, Arnold looked human. When the prejudging began, many athletes whispered backstage that Arnold seemed outclassed. Zayn, even injured, appeared more refined. Chris Dickerson was leaner. Mike Mentzer looked fuller. The stage was stacked with talent. Yet somehow, everyone knew how this story might end. And when it did, the bodybuilding world imploded. Arnold Schwarzenegger was announced as the 1980 Mr. Olympia champion. The arena erupted, not in celebration but in outrage. Booing thundered through the crowd. Competitors were stunned. Some walked off stage in protest, refusing to stand next to Arnold for photos. Veteran pros like Menser and Dickerson called the result a joke. Even the press called it the most controversial decision in bodybuilding history. Rumors spread instantly. Whispers of favoritism, of backstage politics, of judges too starstruck to be objective. To many, it seemed that Arnold hadn't won because he was the best that night, but because he was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And standing in that chaos was Frank Zane, silent, dignified, but burning inside. He later said the words that would echo for decades. Arnold wasn't in his best shape. It wasn't bitterness, it was truth. Zayn had seen what real competition looked like. And this wasn't it. He believed the decision had turned bodybuilding from a sport into a show, one where influence mattered more than integrity. In interviews years later, Zayn's reflections became sharper. He said the judges had been swayed by Arnold's name, his charm, his aura. It was no longer a contest of physiques, it was a coronation. It wasn't his best look, Zayn admitted bluntly. He'd lost size, definition, but he had something more powerful, fame. For many in the audience that night, the magic of the sport cracked. The booing, the walkouts, the angry debates, it all marked a turning point. The 1980 Mr. Olympia wasn't just controversial, it was divisive. It created two camps, those who believed in Arnold's eternal greatness and those who believed the competition had been stolen from the deserving. Arnold, of course, shrugged off the criticism. He called it jealousy, the reaction of men who couldn't handle losing to a legend. Winners step up, he said later. Losers make excuses. But for Frank Zane, that night marked more than just a loss. It was the end of an era, the moment when art bowed to politics, when aesthetics were overshadowed by celebrity. The rivalry that began with respect in 1968 had now turned into quiet resentment, and the wound from Sydney would stay open for decades. But the real story wasn't just on stage. Because behind the smiles, the trophies, and the headlines, something much darker was brewing behind the scenes. The 1980 Olympia wasn't just another bodybuilding contest. It was a full-blown psychological war disguised as a competition. What unfolded on stage that night was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind the curtain, where the cameras didn't reach, was where the real story played out, filled with manipulation, mind games, and unspoken rivalry between two of the sport's most legendary figures, Frank Zane and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Long before the drama in Sydney, Zane and Arnold had shared a curious kind of friendship, one built on mutual respect, but charged with quiet competitiveness. They weren't enemies, but they were never quite allies either. They were equals in different ways. Arnold, the unstoppable force. Zayn, the immovable perfectionist. Both men represented two entirely different philosophies of bodybuilding. And whenever they trained together, the tension was palpable. Zayn often reminisced about those training sessions. He painted vivid pictures of Arnold walking into the gym like a general inspecting his troops, chest out, grin wide, every eye turning his way. When Arnold trained, Zayn once said, it wasn't just exercise, it was a performance. He thrived on energy, on attention, on competition. He'd lift heavy, joke loudly, and challenge those around him, making even a casual workout feel like a championship battle. Zayn was the opposite. Quiet, analytical, detached. His workouts were meditative, each rep a calculation, each pose a study in geometry. While Arnold drew strength from the crowd, Zayn drew it from solitude. When I trained, I wanted silence, he said. That difference, energy versus control, defined everything about their rivalry. Still, despite the respect, there were cracks. Zayn would later describe odd moments during their friendship, times when Arnold's charisma slipped into something more calculated. Arnold had a mischievous streak. He'd tease his rivals, plant subtle doubts, or throw out comments designed to get inside their heads. Once, before a show, Arnold reportedly told Zayn, "You look good, Frank, but maybe a little flat, don't you think?" It was classic Schwarzenegger psychology, playful on the surface, but deeply strategic underneath. To most people, this was just Arnold being Arnold, the charming showman, the confident prankster. But to Zayn, it revealed something else, a man obsessed not only with winning, but with dominating every room he entered. Arnold didn't just want victory, he wanted control of the narrative, the audience, even the emotions of his competitors. So when the rumor spread that Arnold was making a comeback in 1980, Zayn's first reaction wasn't excitement, it was unease. He'd been in enough gyms, enough locker rooms to know that when Arnold stepped in, the energy shifted, and this time that shift would change everything. When Arnold arrived in Sydney, it felt orchestrated, like a grand return written by Hollywood itself. The secrecy around his entry, the media frenzy, the judges suddenly alert and animated. It all fed into the suspicion that something bigger than bodybuilding was at play. And when the results came down, those suspicions turned into outrage. Zayn's disappointment wasn't just about losing, it was about what he believed had been lost. The integrity of the sport itself. In interviews years later, he didn't hold back. He said the 1980 Olympia was the moment bodybuilding stopped being judged by the body and started being judged by the brand. He accused the judging process of being swayed by celebrity influence, claiming that Arnold's return had been treated not like a competition, but a coronation. Arnold had influence, Zayn said bluntly. You can't separate his fame from the result. Everyone wanted to be on his side, even the judges. The whispers didn't stop there. Word spread among competitors that Arnold had been seen backstage talking with officials before the prejudging, smiling, chatting, working the room while others were still preparing. Some even claimed he'd been given special access during certain stages of the scoring process. Nothing was ever proven, but in an already politicized sport, the optics alone were damaging. The idea that bodybuilding's biggest star might also be its biggest manipulator only fueled the fire. Years later, Arnold would address the controversy with surprising candor in his autobiography Total Recall. He admitted that Zayn had been sharper, more defined, and more disciplined during that period. Frank was always more cut, Arnold wrote. He was a perfectionist. I had missed a big thing. I wasn't ready like before. That admission didn't erase the scars. By the time Arnold spoke those words, decades had passed, and the bodybuilding community had already split into two camps. Those who still saw him as the ultimate champion, and those who saw 1980 as the day the sport lost its soul. For Zayn, it wasn't just about one contest, it was about principle. He felt that Arnold's win had redefined bodybuilding, not as a competition of physiques, but as a contest of influence. And perhaps in a way, he was right, because from that night forward, bodybuilding would never again be purely about muscle. It became about charisma, marketing, and how much power one man could wield, both on and off the stage. So what really happened that night? Was it a fair fight that spiraled out of control, or the most perfectly executed power play the sport had ever seen? Let's dig into the fallout. The aftermath of the 1980 Mr. Olympia wasn't just dramatic, it was historic. What should have been a celebration of bodybuilding's greatest stars instead turned into one of the most divisive moments the sport had ever seen. As Arnold Schwarzenegger raised his 8th Sandow trophy, the crowd didn't cheer, they booed, loudly, relentlessly. The discontent wasn't hidden or subtle, it was deafening. Spectators shouted in disbelief, competitors walked off stage, and fans around the world began questioning whether bodybuilding was even fair anymore. For the first time, the sport's integrity was under public attack. Magazines, journalists, and former champions were openly calling out the decision, branding it rigged, political, and predetermined. The image of Arnold smiling on stage while boos echoed through the Sydney Opera House became one of the most haunting visuals in bodybuilding history. In the weeks that followed, the outrage didn't fade. It intensified. Letters poured into bodybuilding publications demanding explanations. Some judges even received threats. The sport that had always been about admiration, discipline, and dedication was now mired in scandal. The bodybuilding community had been split down the middle. Half defended the legend's comeback. The other half called it the death of fair competition. And caught in the middle of it all was Frank Zane. Zayn, ever the stoic professional, didn't explode in public. But in later interviews, he didn't hide his disappointment either. He said the 1980 Olympia left a bad taste in his mouth, not just because he lost, but because it shattered the trust he had in the system. He felt that bodybuilding had traded art and integrity for spectacle and politics. Looking back, Zayn admitted that if he could do it all again, he would have skipped the competition entirely. If I knew what I know now, he said years later, I wouldn't have gone. The event drained him, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Not long after, Zayn quietly stepped away from the Olympia stage for good. But unlike others, he didn't fade into obscurity. Instead, he reinvented himself. He began teaching, writing, and sharing his deep understanding of the human form and mind. Through seminars, books, and lectures, Zayn became an educator, passing down wisdom about balance, training, and longevity. His approach to bodybuilding as both a science and an art inspired generations long after his competitive days ended. Arnold, on the other hand, took a different path. The controversy barely slowed him down. In fact, it seemed to fuel him. Within a year, he was fully immersed in Hollywood, starring in Conan the Barbarian and beginning his transformation from bodybuilding champion to global superstar. While Zayn turned inward, seeking meaning and mastery, Arnold turned outward, conquering film, politics, and pop culture with the same relentless confidence that defined his time on stage. Their post-Olympia journeys couldn't have been more different. Arnold became the world's most recognizable fitness icon. Zayn became the sport's quiet philosopher. One sought fame, the other sought understanding. But both in their own ways helped shape the legacy of bodybuilding. One as its face, the other as its conscience. And yet, decades later, the shadow of 1980 still lingers. The debates never stop. Fans still argue, was it a fair win, a stolen crown, or simply the inevitable clash of two giants destined to define opposite sides of the same story? And now, all these years later, at 83, Frank Zane has finally broken his silence once more. What does he say about that night, that rivalry, and the truth behind it all? 4 decades after that stormy night in Sydney, Frank Zane, now 83 years old, is still reflecting on the event that changed bodybuilding forever. But this time, he isn't holding back. In recent interviews, Zayn has once again exposed what he calls the flaws, secrets, and overlooked truths about Arnold's 1980 Olympia win, and more broadly, about the golden era of bodybuilding itself. But make no mistake, when Zayn exposes something, it's not in the tabloid sense. There's no bitterness, no wild accusations, no petty score settling. Instead, what he's doing is peeling back the curtain on a time that has been so mythologized, so glamorized, that people forget what it was really like. The golden era wasn't just about glory, it was about politics, personalities, and power dynamics. And Zayn, always the thinker, is finally calling it what it was: beautiful but flawed. In his recent reflections, Zayn spoke about how the sport slowly lost its purity. He admitted that the 1980 Olympia wasn't just about Arnold's comeback. It was about a system that rewarded charisma over craftsmanship. He described how, even then, bodybuilding was becoming less about the body and more about the brand. It stopped being about the best physique, he said, and started being about who could sell the show. And yet, Zayn doesn't speak with hatred. If anything, there's a sense of calm acceptance, a philosopher's understanding that the world evolves, even if not always for the better. He still credits Arnold for being the greatest promoter the sport ever had, the man who brought bodybuilding to the mainstream. But he also makes it clear that Arnold's influence came at a cost, one that changed the sport's DNA forever. By revealing these quiet truths, Zayn doesn't just reframe the 1980 Olympia, he reframes the entire golden era. Suddenly, those old black and white gym photos, those legendary Venice Beach stories take on a new meaning. The friendships were real, but so were the rivalries. The physiques were flawless, but the politics were brutal. And the victories, as Zayn now reminds us, weren't always won under the lights. Sometimes, they were decided long before the show even began. Zayn's words don't diminish Arnold's legacy, they humanize it. They remind us that even legends have flaws, and even icons operate in imperfect systems. His honesty gives depth to the mythology, showing that behind every pose, every trophy, every flex, there was also struggle, ego, and compromise. At 83, Frank Zane has nothing left to prove. His legacy is untouchable, and perhaps that's why his words now carry more weight than ever, because they come not from rivalry, but from reflection. He isn't speaking as the man who lost in 1980, but as the man who finally understands what that loss revealed about the sport, and about himself. It's not revenge, it's revelation, and it changes the way we see everything. Arnold's victory, Zayn's silence, and the golden glow of a bygone era that for all its beauty was far more complicated than anyone dared to admit. From rivalry to respect, from victory to controversy, the story of Frank Zane and Arnold Schwarzenegger is more than just a tale of two bodybuilders. It's a mirror reflecting the soul of an entire sport. What began as mutual admiration in the 1960s evolved into one of bodybuilding's most iconic rivalries, culminating in the shocking events of the 1980 Mr. Olympia, a moment that still divides fans over 40 years later. And now, decades later, the silence has broken. At 83, Frank Zane's truth bombs hit harder than ever, not with anger but with honesty. His reflections strip away the myth and expose what really powered the golden era. Ambition, ego, brilliance, and politics, all woven together beneath the glow of perfect lighting. His words force us to look beyond the smiles and the sandos, to ask uncomfortable questions about fairness, fame, and legacy. Because if the champion himself could be exposed this late in the game, what else has the sport been hiding all along? So now it's your turn. What do you think? Did Arnold truly deserve that 1980 win? Or was it the night bodybuilding lost its soul? Drop your thoughts below. Let's see where you stand. The legacy of Frank Zane and Arnold Schwarzenegger still echoes through every gym mirror, every competition stage, and every debate that refuses to die. But today we see it with fresh eyes, not as legend versus legend, but as truth versus myth. And maybe that's the real victory, the one that time finally revealed.